Chapter 11, Pirates and Spaniards in the Bahamas. The Bahamas, as we have read, were the first islands sighted by Columbus when he crossed the Atlantic in 1492. He called them the Lucayos. The word Bahama does not appear on charts until 30 years later, and its origin is unknown. It may be a Spanish-sounding Arawak word, or it may come from two Spanish words, the first of which was Bahia, meaning bay. Many of the islands of the Bahamas bear the same names on our present-day charts as they did on the charts of the early 16th century. There was no gold to be found in the Bahamas, so the Spaniards took little interest in them beyond carrying off natives to work in the mines and plantations of Cuba and other islands. For this reason, many of the old native names are still in use: Bimini, Abaco, Exuma, Seman, Inagua. The island on which Columbus landed was called by the natives Guanahani. He renamed it San Salvador. But during the 18th century, it came to be called Watling's Island after a famous pirate, whose only virtue was that he made his men observe the Sabbath strictly and did so himself. Now the name San Salvador has been restored by the Bahama Assembly. The story of the Bahamas is very different from those of Barbados and St. Kitts. The British colony of the Bahamas celebrated its 300th birthday in 1929 because it was in October 1629 that King Charles I granted to Sir Robert Heath a territory in America, which included, among other islands, the Bahamas. Though Sir Robert himself never visited the islands, a British settlement was made on New Providence in 1629. Settlers from Bermuda colonized Eleuthera in 1647, and more Bermudians came to the Bahamas later. But the islands were frequently attacked by the Spaniards. In 1633, the French government granted certain islands in the Bahamas to a French nobleman, but no attempt was made to set up a French colony. The Bahamas was surrounded by shoals and coral reefs. Many of the early settlers made a living by piloting distressed vessels through the dangerous waters and by rescuing goods from wrecks, of which they were allowed a legal share. These wreckers, as they were called, sometimes went to a reef known as the Old Rack, on which many Spanish treasure ships had been wrecked in the early days of Spanish conquests in the New World. Divers were let down, and it is said, large quantities of silver and treasure were recovered. In 1670, King Charles II put the Bahamas in charge of certain landowners in the colony of Carolina on the mainland. But the islands were neglected and became a stronghold for pirates. One of the most famous of these pirates was a Welshman named Edward Teach. He was known as Blackbeard on account of his long black beard, which he plaited in strands and tied with ribbons behind his ears. He was usually dressed in purple velvet coat, bright red breeches, sandals, but no stockings. In his belt, he carried a brace of pistols and two long stilettos, or daggers. His headquarters were on the island of New Providence near Nassau. A tower on a hill behind that town is still called Blackbeard's Tower. He was killed in a hand-to-hand fight in 1717. The following year, King George I sent out Woodes Rogers to restore order and end piracy in the Bahamas. In this, he was quite successful. With very little fuss, he set to work, appointing a council of 12 trustworthy men, a judge, and other officials. Then came before the council about 200 of those who had been pirates and surrendered themselves to the governor and took the oath of allegiance to His Majesty King George, as did several inhabitants of these islands. In this way, piracy in the Bahamas, the last stronghold of sea robbers on the Atlantic coast of America, came to an end. And as a lasting record of this, the colony took as its motto, Expulsis piratis restituta commercia, which means, the pirates having been driven out, commerce is restored. In 1729, the first Bahamas House of Assembly was elected. But the Bahamas had other adventures. The Spaniards, who had seized the islands in 1684, but had quickly been driven out, made unsuccessful attempts in 1719 and 1720 to take Nassau, the capital of the islands. Again in 1741, there were rumors that the Spaniards were preparing an attack from Havana, and the House of Assembly ordered a new fort, Fort Montagu, to be built. The fort was built of local stone, which, when quarried, was so soft that it could be cut with little labor. Yet after being exposed to the air for a time, it became very hard. It was also claimed that this stone did not crack when hit by a cannonball. The Spaniards did not attack Fort Montagu at that time, but in 1776, at the beginning of the American War of Independence, it was taken by a party of Americans led by Commodore Hopkins, who became the admiral of the first United States Navy. With 8 vessels, he sailed to Abaco and then to Salt Cay anchorage, not far from Fort Montagu. The fort was surprised and taken. The Americans hoped to find gunpowder and other munitions, but the governor had been warned that there might be an attack and had hidden most of the powder. The Americans managed to carry off some cannons and stores, but they soon left the island without causing much interference to everyday life. In 1782, the Spaniards, who were helping the Americans against Britain, captured the islands, but they were restored to Britain by a treaty the following year. Before the news of the signing of the treaty could be carried across the Atlantic, the Spaniards had already been driven out of New Providence by Colonel de Vaux. He had less than 250 men, and of these only 150 had muskets. He disguised some of his men as Indians and dressed figures of straw in their uniforms. A great show of boats was made, rowing between the ships and the shore. Apparently, the boats were refilled when they returned to the ships, and more men were landed. But actually, they were always the same men. They pretended to land, but each time they went back to the ships, lying down in the bottom of the boats and hidden from the view of the Spaniards on guard. Thinking he was faced by a very powerful force, the Spanish governor surrendered after a well-directed shot had been fired at his house. He was very disgusted when he found he had yielded to a small, badly equipped body of men, but it was then too late to make any resistance. He was shipped off to Europe, and his men were sent back to Havana. That was the last of the Spaniards in the Bahamas.